And let's go ahead and remove this line because we're not going to be using that. And this line up here, I want you to cut that, and we'll go ahead and put it right here. And variable declaration statements are the only statements in Visual Basic that can be outside or inside the subprocedure. And depending on which way you have it, it can affect your macro in certain ways, but it's really beyond the scope of this series. So for our purposes, I'm going to try to keep the variable declarations right next to the lines on which values are assigned to the variables. So you should have your code looking like this. And now what is next? In order to accomplish what we're trying to do, ultimately be able to add a configuration to that part and then create a drawing, what do we need to do next? What kind of steps do we need to take now to get this macro to the finished version I showed you a while ago? Well, first of all, let's consider what is going to need to happen in our macro. We entered a value in the user form. In the user form, we're going to hold off on doing that for right now. But we entered a value and then a new configuration was created. So let's start there. Let's consider how we would create a new configuration in our macro. So let's go down to the API help, and we're going to be coming back here often, so be prepared for that. And like we did before when we typed in messages, let's just type in configuration, and we see that first of all, there is apparently an interface called iConfiguration. But instead of going right there, let's actually look through here until we find this, add. So if I double click on this, here is add configuration 3 and I add configuration 3. Well, we know that both of these are methods, and I just explained to you that basically if you see an I in front of a method, you need to just ignore it. So we'll double click on add configuration 3, and it says adds a new configuration to this model document. Great, that's exactly what we need. So how do we use this? Well, we could look at the parameters, and we will do that in a little bit, but notice up here that this belongs to an interface called iModelDoc2. In our macro right now, do we have access to an interface called iModelDoc2? No. Right now, all we have access to is this guy, SWApp, which is of type iSLDWorks. And by the way, don't get confused. I'm going to call this iSLDWorks, but that's just the object interface that it represents. This is still the name I gave it. So keep the two separate, the actual interface versus the name you call the variable that is used to represent the interface. So right now we only have access to iSLDWorks. How do we get access to iModelDoc2? And this is where the SOLIDWORKS API Object Model comes in. The API Object Model is set up like a hierarchy. And up at the top you have iSLDWorks, and then below that you have the second highest object, which is iModelDoc2. And iModelDoc2 is going to give us access to the different documents within SOLIDWORKS. So think parts, assemblies, drawings, and each of those have their own interface as well. And then within those interfaces, there's going to be even deeper interfaces that correspond to objects that are only available in particular part documents. So for example, within an assembly, there is iComponent2. Well, you would expect that to be accessed through iAssemblyDoc and not iDrawingDoc. And likewise with iView and that kind of thing. Now there's also interfaces that correspond to all the documents. So for example, the feature manager tree, that exists in all three documents. So that's available directly through iModelDoc2. And iModelDoc2 is kind of then the more general parent interface that allows you to have access to functionality that is available within all three of the more specific interface types. That way they didn't need to keep creating identical interfaces to do, something you could do in all three documents. So again, this hierarchy, it lets us go deeper and deeper into the API, and the way you get between interfaces, the way you go from one interface to the next is through special API calls that are called Accessors. So while we're in the Add Configuration 3 page, let's go to this iModelDoc2 interface page, because that's the interface we're trying to access. And again, notice it says allows access to parts, assemblies, and drawings. And also here's examples that we can look at if necessary. Here's the remarks section that I mentioned earlier that will give some info that you might want to read. But down here, this is really what I'm concerned about. These special API calls that are called accessors. And accessors are what you want to use to get access to whatever interface you're currently in. So, since right now all we have access to is SOLIDWORks and we're trying to go to iModelDoc2, are we going to be able to use an accessor that is available within iComponent2? No. We would need to find an accessor that's available within SOLIDWORks. So if we move down the list, we see that there are several API calls available within SOLIDWORks that'll give us access to iModelDoc2. And first of all, a note on format. You'll notice in the API help that when an interface is described followed by an API call, it is separated by 2 colons, and that's just the syntax that is used to describe an API call. And you always want to include the interface with the API call because a lot of times API calls will have the same name but belong to different interfaces. So just as an example, let's type in something really generic, text. Right here's lots of different text properties, but notice they all belong to different interfaces, so they don't all do the same thing. And if you're actually trying to get to the text property for iSketchText, then you don't want to mistakenly try to get access to iTreeControlItem to use that text property, because they're not doing the same thing. So again, you'll see this format used a lot, and it's always the interface followed by the API call. So now looking through this list of API calls, which one do you think is going to be most useful in the situation we're in right now, where all we have access to is SOLIDWORks, and this is very, very important, notice that the part is already up. So that's a precondition. That's something we're assuming before the macro is run, that the part is already open. Now, going back here, which of these corresponds to our situation? Right here is Activate Doc. If you click in there, you'll find out that that's how you switch between different documents. Here's Active Doc. There's Get First Document, maybe. Get Open Document, also maybe. Here's one with an I in front, so we're ignoring that. Load file, that doesn't seem to be relevant. New document, no, we're not creating a new document. Open Doc 7, again, we're not opening a new document. So let's go back up here. We bookmarked this one in our minds. Let's click in here and look at this. Gets the currently active document. Well, gee, that sounds like exactly what we need. So let's go ahead and use it. Again, if you're not exactly sure how to use it, just come down here, find an example that's in VBA. And if we click in here, we see it right here. Right here's the code that we already have set, SWApp equals application.SOLIDWORks, and then they created, and by they I mean whoever wrote this help example, created a variable for iModelDoc2 called SWModel, and I know that this represents iModelDoc2 because if you go up to their declaration, notice dim SWModel as SOLIDWORks. They left the I off of the front like they're supposed to, ModelDoc2. So SWModel equals SWApp, so this is their iSOLIDWORks variable. They put a dot in and they accessed the ActiveDoc member, and that's how they returned, or that's how they assigned the value to SWModel. And of course, since they're assigning a value to an object, they used the set keyword. So basically, this is exactly what we need right here. And if you want to copy that and paste it, you can. Otherwise, I like to get into a habit of typing everything out manually just so the syntax and the spelling and all that kind of thing gets kind of embedded in my memory. Let's go back up here, and I like to keep variable declarations grouped together if I can. So let's say SWModel as SOLIDWORks, ModelDoc2, and then come down here and say set SWModel equals SWApp.ActiveDoc. So with that, we've already moved down at least one step in this SOLIDWORks API hierarchy. We're moving through the API to get to what we need, which is, if we go back to the API help, ultimately We're trying to get to add configuration 3. So now that we have access to iModelDoc2, you're probably thinking what I'm thinking. Can't we just type in SWModel and then hit a dot? And since I included the specific data type in the variable declaration, it's going to give me a drop-down list of everything available in iModelDoc2. And indeed, that is the case. And if I come back up here and type in add, notice it takes us to add configuration. Now, should I use the earlier version of add configuration 2? Should I use this second oldest, this newest? Which one should I generally use? Generally, most of the time you will want to use the newest version. However, there are times where the newest version contains a lot of bells and whistles that you don't care about, in which case it might be more expedient to use an earlier version. And basically, to compare versions, you just need to go into the API help. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just use the newest version because I know it doesn't have that many arguments. So the first argument it wants is the name of the configuration. And then after that, it wants a comment as a string, alternate name as string, options as long. Well, the first one, I'm pretty sure I could guess what that's supposed to be. So I could call it something like test, and then I would hit a comma, and it would take me to the next parameter. But I'm not exactly sure what these do, so that's when I'm going to go into the API help, and we're going to go down to the parameters section, and I'm going to look at these comments. So name, that was name of the new configuration, so I guessed right. And then comment is comment displayed in configuration properties. Alternate name is an alternate config name, and those two guys I really don't care about. And then options is a combination of one or more Boolean options defined in, and we're familiar with this. This is one of those enumeration guys. Okay, so what we're going to do is come down here, and we can actually pick as many of these as we want. So if for some reason you wanted to use this option, which does correspond to BOM tables, it looks like, you could hit Control Copy, paste that in, and then if you wanted, oh, excuse me, we're not to options yet. Let's put in 2 more commas so we get to the last argument, and I'll go back to those other ones in a moment. But let's say that we want this one, and then we also want another option to be included. Then we have to put the plus, and then we would just grab another one and include it like that. And I'm just doing that as an example. I don't actually want that. I'm just showing you that that's how you would do it. Again, those enumeration members correspond to actual numbers. Since I don't actually want any of these options, I'm just going to put in a 0. And so it's going to ignore them all. Now, for these other guys, let's come back here. And I don't want to mess with them either, so what do? Do I just type in some random text I don't care about? Well, since they are strings, if you just want to ignore them, you can just type in empty. And that will basically create a 0-length string. So it's basically the same thing as just typing something like that, a string with no length to it. So I'm just going to put in empty, and you can always do this if you want to ignore something like an integer, a double, a long, a string, that kind of thing. And then in the case of the options, I just put in a 0. Note though that not all enumerations can be added on to one another like I showed you. Sometimes you can only put in one at a time, so you just really need to look in the API help. And in this case it says combination, so that's how I know I could have added them together, but that's not always the case. So just wanted to point that out. And then also this API call will actually return a newly created configuration. And if I click in here, notice it takes me to the iConfiguration interface. Now this is cool because this method I used is not only adding a new configuration, but it's actually acting as an accessor that takes me to the iConfiguration interface. And if I go into the members page for this interface, notice I now have all of these different API calls to work with related to configurations. However, I don't actually need to delve down that deep. Now, let's go ahead and get out of this. I don't actually need to delve down that deep into the SOLIDWORKS API, at least as it relates to configurations. So I'm not going to worry about returning the iConfiguration interface And I'm just going to leave this like it is. Notice I don't have the parentheses in because I'm not returning anything. And let's go ahead and save this, and now let's test it out. So go back to our part, and there we have a configuration called test. Alright, so now that we've done this test, I'm going to hit my shortcut key that will let me reload this part because I want to go back to where I was originally. That's something I do frequently when I work with macros. You know, I want to go back to where I started during my testing. And now let's keep going. I do want to say though that at this point, if you've understood generally what I just did with the API help in figuring out how to get to the point where I could use Add Configuration 3 by first figuring out how I could access the interface it belongs to. If you understood all that, then really you fought and won half the battle. Because if you don't get that, if you don't get that point about accessors and how to find them in the API help and how to use them, then you're going to have a nightmare using the SOLIDWORKS API. Now, that being said, you're not a master with the API now, so everything we do from this point on is just going to be reinforcing these skills I just showed you. What I want to do next is I actually want to add a little bit of code before we add this configuration. And in this piece of code, I actually want to add in some error handling. I want to check and make sure that the user has a part open before the rest of the code runs. Because think about it, if we tried to run this code right now in a drawing, there could be problems. So how do we do that? Again, we're going to go back to the API help. This is going to be a real recurring theme, as you'll find out. And let's just type in the word document. And the reason I'm typing in the word document is because ultimately what we're trying to do is figure out the type of document. Because we need to test that, and so we need to test and make sure that the document type is part. So I'm typing in document, and then you see that there is this list of topics, and if we move down here, it might take a little while, but eventually you're going to run into this, types. So double click on that, and look at this. Within iModelDoc2, which is an interface we already have access to, there is a method called getType. Sounds very promising, so let's double click on it. And it says it gets the type of document. It's exactly what we need. And if we move down here, notice there are no arguments. There's only a return value. So this should be pretty simple to use. And the return value is the type of document as defined in this enumeration. So if we click in here, here's the different document types. Assembly, drawing, and part are really the only three we're concerned about. So what I'm going to do is copy this. And since we're doing a test, we need to use the if statement, the if then else statement. So what I'm going to do is say if swmodel.getType does not equal. How do I do does not equal? All you have to do is two brackets facing one another, and that's the opposite of equals. Then I'm going to paste in what I just copied from the API help. Then, and I'm going to close that off with end if. And I'm actually not going to use an else statement here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to send a message to the user that warns them you need to be in a part, and then I'm going to end the macro. However, instead of just typing end, what I'm going to do is actually just type exit sub, which in this case it's basically doing the same thing. It's just leaving the sub procedure immediately, so it won't run anything else. And the reason I'm not doing end is because later when we have the user form up, basically I want the user to be able to click that add configuration button, and it'll run this test, and it might notify them that they need to be in a part, but then it won't automatically end the macro and close the user form. Instead, it'll just leave the sub procedure, but the user form will still be up, and so they don't have to go back and reopen that. Hopefully that made sense. But at this point, let's also include a message box. So send MSG to user or send MSG to user 2. I showed you how to use both. You know that this one has more arguments that lets you do more, but this one only has one argument. And since all I need to do is show the user a message box with an OK button, I'm just going to use the first version just because it's a little simpler. It'll save me a little bit of time. So we'll say, please open a part. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's save this, and let's go back here and open a drawing. Okay, and if I run this, please open a part. Good. And then if I come back here and run this, it should run and add the configuration, and it does. So let's go ahead and reload that and come back here. Now before we move on any further, there's another good programming habit that I want you to get into. So I'm going to show you right now how to add comments to your code. Because as you write a lot of code, it's going to get more and more convoluted, and it's hard enough to think through sometimes while you're writing it. But imagine if you save it and then you're using it for a while, and 6 months down the road you realize you need to edit it, maybe improve it, or make some changes. Well, you're going to reopen the code and you're going to think, okay, what on earth was going on here? And a lot of times you might have to actually step by step move through the code and figure out what was going on. Well, what's helpful is if you document your code along the way, so you can tell yourself, or maybe a coworker if he decides to edit your code, what was going on in a particular section. So to do that, we're just going to put in an apostrophe, and right here I'm going to say test the document type. And as soon as I move my cursor off, notice it turns green, indicating that it is a comment. And notice I didn't have to obey any kind of syntax when I typed out the comment. That's because whenever your code is compiled and run, all of these lines that begin with an apostrophe are just ignored. So they're not included. However, I do want to note that you can also put comments on the end of statements. So I could have typed test the document type and put it on the end there, and that'll work just fine. Obviously I can't put it at the beginning, otherwise it would consider this whole thing a comment. However, sometimes that's useful. Let's say that for some reason you want to just ignore a piece of code during your testing, but you don't want to actually delete it, because you don't want to have to rewrite it, or you don't want to be copying and pasting it from somewhere. So if we wanted to just really quickly remove this test from our code, I could just put apostrophes in front of all that, and now it's out of the way. And then later, when I want to bring it back in, just delete those. And you'll be doing that quite a bit when you're programming. So good habit to start using comments early on. And I'll go ahead and add another one down here, add configuration. I'll put one up here, get access to document. And I'm going to keep adding them as we go, and feel free to add additional comments of your own that will help you understand the code. And then let's go up and save this again as well. Alright, so at this point we've gotten access to the document, we've tested the document type, we've added a configuration. Now let's consider how we can actually change the dimension of that hole wizard diameter. So to do that, let's go back to SOLIDWORKS first and actually take a look at this. If I zoom in and double click on the hole wizard hole, right here is the guy that I'm ultimately trying to change. So click on that, and over here under primary value, it's this whole die at sketch 5. That's what I'm trying to control. So somehow I need to get access to that dimension, and I need to be able to change its value. So I'm going to go ahead and hit copy. And let's go back to our macro now. And just as a comment, you might be wondering, wait, why aren't you adding in the user form at this point and trying to get a value? Well, I like to approach macros in a structured manner, and I like to hit the fundamentals, the core parts of the macro first, get those working, and then add on what I consider to be the detail work. So in this case, I consider the user form to be very helpful. It's very user-friendly, but it's really not essential to the core of the macro. So I want to get the rest of this working and make sure all the bugs are taken care of before I move on to the user interface stuff. So down here, we'll say get the dimension and change its value. Now, how are we going to figure out what code to put here? Well, again, let's just go back to the API help. And you can probably guess what I'm going to type up here. as topic, I'll just type in dimension. And now we're interested in learning about how to get the dimension value. So let's scroll down here until we find values, and there it is. Double click on this, and this did not take us to an API help page. However, don't despair. If we scroll down, this should show us something that's helpful to what we want. So moving down here, we can just look at the names that are bolded, and right here is something that says get system value 3 and set system value 3. It looks like that's where they retrieved the current dimension value and then reset the value. So it looks like this is what we need, set system value 3. So let's go ahead and take that, and I'll type it in, set system value 3, and I notice it belongs to the iDimension interface. That makes sense, that's pretty intuitive. So how do I get access to iDimension? Well, I could go into here and then go into here and go down there and look at the accessors, and it's a really short list, so it probably wouldn't take me very long to find the one I need. But actually, if we stay back in this example, we can figure it out pretty quick as well. So if we go back up to the top here, we see that they called their iDimension interface SWDIM. That's the variable name they chose. So really all we need to do is look in the code and see where they said set SWDIM equals and see how they did that. And maybe it'll correspond to our scenario. Not necessarily, but maybe it will. So come back down here and we see they have set SWDIM equals SWModel.parameter, and then in parentheses you can see that they put in the dimension name. Well, let's make the assumption that SWModel in this macro corresponds to iModel.doc2, and if you look up here, indeed it does. So we know that we already have access to that, so we should be able to use this line. We'll just type in SWModel.parameter and just do exactly what they did. So let's come back here and say set SWDIM, and I'll declare that in a moment, equals SWModel.parameter, and in parentheses I'm going to paste in what I copied from the part. And now let's go ahead and declare this right here, SWDIM as SLDWorks. Don't forget to type that SLDWorks. And then dimension, remember, leave the I off the front. So right there, we declared it, and we assigned a value to SWDIM. So that's going to give us access to the iDimension interface, and now we should be able to use this. So in our case, we don't need to get the current value because we wouldn't be doing anything with it. We're simply going to set the value. So let's go ahead and just copy this and come in here and say SWDIM dot, and then I'll just paste that in, or you can type it in. And then there are 3 arguments. So the first argument is what you would expect. It's the actual value you want to change that dimension to, and it's as a double, so that's good. We know we can include decimal values in there. But then what about these other guys? Which configurations and config names? Well, obviously it has something to do with configurations, but let's go into the API help to find out exactly what. Just double click on set system value 3 after you've typed it in here, and it'll take you to the API help page. And if we go down to the parameters section, which configurations is the configuration in which to set this value as defined in, and again, it's an enumeration, so you see that these are used quite often. So if we move down here, we see that we can specify all configurations, or if we move down here, we can specify a particular configuration, or we can just say the current one, so this configuration. Well, it wouldn't make any sense to apply the value to all configurations. That would defeat the purpose. So let's go ahead and do it just for the current configuration. I'll go ahead and highlight that, hit Control-C, come back here. And for the value, let's just arbitrarily for now, we'll put in 15. And then I'll paste that in for which configurations. And then what about this last guy? Let's come back here to the API help, go back. Go to this, names of the configurations. Well, just reading that, I don't really know what to do, but here it says see remarks. So let's move down here, And it says right here, the config names argument is only used if which configurations is set to that. So if that enumeration member is chosen for the second parameter, then we would actually specify the configuration name. And if I go into the syntax section again, you see that it's variant, so it could accept a string, or it could actually accept a group of strings if we wanted to apply it to multiple configurations. But we're not going to get into that. We're just going to ignore this since we didn't use this enumeration member. So we'll just come back here and we'll say empty. So now at this point, let's try it out. Let's click save and make sure that we have back in our part, make sure that we do have the part open, make sure that we haven't already added test, and let's click run. So as you can tell, this really doesn't look any different to what we had before. Did we do something wrong? Well, let's double click on the first one again and try going into the test. And when we do that, we see that it actually wants us to rebuild the document. So apparently the change was made to the dimension, but it didn't automatically rebuild. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Within our code, we're going to have to specifically include a line that rebuilds the document. So let's go ahead and click rebuild now. And this doesn't look good. We have totally wiped out that base. Why did that happen? Well, first of all, I'm going to reload this, take us back to where we were before, and come back in here. And this is where you need to know that what we entered in here is wrong. We made a mistake. It's not wrong of us to want to change the whole diameter to 15 millimeters, but it's wrong of us to make the assumption that this argument is being accepted as millimeters. And it's not. By default, when you enter a value into the SOLIDWORKS API, a distance value that is, it is entered as meters. And so if you want something else, even inches, then you need to make the conversions in the code to make that happen. So in this case, we need to put in a divide by 1,000 to actually get the millimeter value. And likewise, I'll mention that with angles, the default is radians, not degrees. So you'll need to do a conversion between the two if necessary. So now let's try this out. And again, we have to go back to the first configuration and then to the second. And there we can see that it did change the dimension to 15 like we would expect. So now let's go ahead and take care of this rebuild issue. Reload my part. And now let's go right into the API help. And I could type in rebuild, but technically I'm trying to rebuild a document, so I'll just type in document and see what that gives me first. So move down here until I run into rebuild, and indeed there is a topic, and I'll double click on this, and there's a forced rebuild example, and then there's also a rebuild method, and it belongs to iModel.doc2, so let's check this out. If I double click in here, it says rebuilds the model in assembly and drawing documents only. Okay, so that's actually not going to help me. So let's double click on this again and go back to that example and see if this is something that's helpful. Scroll down here, and pretty simple example here. Looks like they are using their iModel.doc2 variable, and they're using a API call called force rebuild 3. So let's put this into the index tab and see if this is something we could use. Well, first of all, make sure that you go to the one under iModel.doc2, which I'll also make a note there. Unlike with API calls, you always want to be using the newer version with interfaces, pretty much across the board without exception. I can't think of any interface where I'm using the older version of it. So anyway, we're technically in this guy. And it says forces a rebuild of all the features in the model whether they need a rebuild. Well, technically we don't need to go to that length. We really only need to do a basic rebuild, but you know, for our purposes this will do just fine since we're in a pretty small part. Shouldn't hurt anything if we do a full rebuild. So let's go ahead and use this, and let's take a look at the parameters. So top only. true rebuilds the top level assembly only, false rebuilds the top level and all subassemblies. Okay, so this seems to apply to assemblies. Well, then I guess it really shouldn't matter which one we put in. We either put in a true or a false, and since we're putting in a true or a false, we can verify in the syntax section that indeed it wants a Boolean. So that's why we're putting in true or false. And then we can get the return value if we want. True if the rebuild is successful, false if not, but it's really not something we need to do. So let's just come back here and let's put in another comment that says rebuild the document, and we'll say SW model force rebuild 3. And again, doesn't really matter what you put in there since we're not in an assembly. I guess you could have put in empty if you wanted, but we'll just put in true and that'll work just fine. So let's try this out now. And as you can see, we are in test, and it looks like it has rebuilt it successfully. So that's good. Everything's working the way it should thus far. Alright, so next up, I now want to simply save the part. I want to automatically do that. I don't know if I mentioned that that's part of what we're going to do earlier, but we are going to save the document at this point. Not do a save as, but just simply do a save. So at this point, I'd like you to have some practice, so you might consider stopping the video at this point and seeing if you can figure out on your own what line of code needs to be typed. So moving ahead, let's go into the API help again, and let's go back to our trusty document topic, and let's scroll down until we find a section called save, and there is save. So let's double click in here. And quite a few options. Get save flag. No, that doesn't make sense. Save document as TIFF. Nope. How about save 3? That sounds good. There's save as. We know we don't want to do save as at this point, so let's just double click on save 3, and it says saves the current document. Sounds good. So let's scroll down and look at the parameters. Under options, mode in which to save the document as defined in, and if I click in here, there's a lot of stuff we can use. The only one I'm going to take advantage of is this one, silent. So basically, think of when you save a document and sometimes it prompts you whether you want to do a rebuild before saving. Basically, this save as silent is going to eliminate that dialog box. And why would we want that in a macro? The reason we would want it is because if you write some macro that's intended to say run overnight while you're out of the office or maybe while you're in a meeting, it would really stink if you started running it and then you came back to it an hour or so later and you found out that the whole time the macro was paused because it was sitting at this dialog box prompting you to do something. So you need to, when you write macros, figure out ways to eliminate possible bottlenecks and hangups so everything can keep running smoothly. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose of automation. So let's go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to come back in here and we'll type in SW model save 3, and I'll put in that guy for my first argument. And then let's move on to errors and warnings. Let's go back here, and this is a little different. Errors that cause the save operation to fail, and then warnings generated during the save operation. Well, this is kind of odd because these seem to be sending information back to me, and yet I thought I was supposed to be giving information to the API call. Well, you can in fact have parameters that output data to you. And an easy way you can tell is, even though we're not writing in C++, I just like to glance up here. Notice how it has out in front of it? Well, right there it's telling me that the argument is coming out to me. So what I can do, since it's defined as an enumeration, and I know that an enumeration corresponds to a long value, what I could do is create some variable like, say, LNG error or LNG warning, and then after this API call is run, I could look at LNG error or warning, and maybe depending on what happens, I could notify the user and say, you know, there was an error during save and this is what the error was. So here's a list of all the different things that can go wrong and prevent the document from being saved. However, in our case, I'm not real concerned about there being issues, so I'm just going to ignore these arguments. And to do that, like I showed you before, I'll just put in empty. So when you tried this on your own, you might have got a little hung up on the fact that they were output arguments, but you might have chosen to just put in empty anyway. If you didn't, that's okay. That was something a little new. So at this point, we're pretty much done with adding the configuration and modifying the part, and now we've saved it. So now we can go on to creating the drawing. And again, at the very end, when we add in the user form, that's when we'll give the user the ability to control whether they want the drawing created. Right now, we'll set it up so that it's automatically created.